If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that humans will believe almost anything. On Blasphemy with Chris and Marnee, we take a look at some of these beliefs, uncover their very human origins, how they've developed and changed over time, and the very real consequences they had in society and culture. Impacts that continue even today in our lives. My name is Chris Setti, and with me, as always, is my wife, Marnee.
Hi.
We're coming at you from Spokane, Washington, where we've been. So we just completed our 4th week of lockdown. We were one of the states that got the early kind of thing.
Yeah.
Luckily, I mean, things are working out pretty good if you look at the numbers anyway.
We were the first state in Washington.
Yeah.
Brought it in.
Yeah, I mean, I think California did a lot of like real strict stuff.
No, I mean, we brought the disease in.
True. We were the first place. Well, I mean,
first ship to go down.
Sure. But yeah, we're doing okay.
Yeah.
No one's sick.
No one's sick. I don't know if we're okay.
We're just like going insane. It's fine.
It's fine.
But today, what we're going to do, tonight, I guess I should say, we're coming at you late on a Friday night because what else the fuck we got to do? We don't even know what day it is usually.
I know. Doesn't even matter.
Yeah, we're going to continue our look at the 1980s and 90s satanic panic around Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And the first episode, you can go listen to that. It goes over kind of the spark that lit the fire, which we'll hear a little bit about today. But tonight, I want to talk about where the magical thinkers come in, right? Where the people who, while these kids are playing in a basement with their friends in a intentionally imaginary world, they all understand it's just fantasy. They're there to escape and be creative and all these things. Then there's a group of people who believe magic is real, and they kind of come on the scene, and they're quite a cast of characters, and it's always fun to really dig into people like this and see what's really going on, because it's never, ever what they want you to perceive, and they're usually asking for money, so good times there. First, what I'm going to do is acknowledge the sources that I used for this series. First of all, I used a book called Satanic Panic, Pop Cultural Paranoia in the 1980s. Great book. If you're into that kind of stuff, if you like books with a lot of pictures and you want to hear about some of the zaniness that went around, oh man, rock music in the 80s and the kind of satanic panic around that, and role-playing games and cartoons and action figures and movies and, man, everything. There's this moral crusade against pretty much all of pop culture in the 80s. And so if you want to see what that looked like and just see some amazing pictures from the 80s, because we were so much cooler than you guys back then. Pick that book up. You can get it on Amazon, Satanic Panic, Pop Cultural Paranoia in the 1980s. I also leaned heavily on a book by a religious studies teacher down in Texas. I think he's at the University of Texas or some shit like that, or Texas University, something like that. His name is Joseph Laycock, and the book he wrote was called Dangerous Games, What the Moral Panic Over Role-Playing Games Says About Play, Religion, and Imagined Worlds. And it's cool. It's kind of like a boiling down, I think, of a thesis that he wrote for his, his master's or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it explores kind of the idea of the imagination and role playing and how that factors into kind of like human experience. But he focuses in on how that imagination is also present in these people going around against it. And those are the people we're going to talk about tonight. Mm-hmm. And then I also used a book called In Pursuit of Satan, The Police and the Occult. There'll be more stuff next episode around that book when we get into more of like the moral crusaders and what are known as moral entrepreneurs that go out and kind of create these organizations and these moms groups that are like demanding that things change for the children. And finally, one of the best resources I've ever found when it comes to like if you're interested in the history of Dungeons and Dragons or all of this stuff around controversies and like suicides and the things that have become attached to Dungeons and Dragons, or at least became attached then, whether you know it or not, that was a big deal back then. There's a website called theescapist.com. It is great. I think they're guys that are like my age. They were D&D nerds, and they've kind of lived through this whole saga. And they have this huge archive of stuff. And I was able to go back and read some of these things, and they have quite a treasure trove of information of newspaper articles and just the facts and the kind of the evidence that this happened, and that, holy shit, you read this newspaper article and you think about reading it in the paper now and you're like, oh my God, we would laugh this. They would never make it into a newspaper. But back then, the world was much more magical, Yeah. I mean, there are people obviously now that are totally magical thinkers. Tons. Not just Christians. I mean, like hippies and like all kinds of people that believe in these magical realms. But back then, it was like almost like we accepted it all as true in the culture at large, and we didn't just go like, there are certain people that
you could talk about it real. Yeah, now in the mainstream, like just like journalism, you can't really like.
You could not write an article about satanic powers or some shit happening and have it published in any reputable newspaper. Sure, you can get it on some website or some conspiracy theorists, whatever is going on out there. But not in like the New York Times, not in like, some mainstream newspaper in some city. But that's what was happening. And this was crazy.
Yeah.
And so let's get into it. The true magical thinkers were moral crusaders, primarily evangelical Christians. Now, that's largely because they dominate our culture, but it was the people that largely drove a lot of the moral panic, especially around Dungeons and Dragons, because they have that devil component, right? They have the Satan component. Whereas there are probably people of other faiths that were concerned with Dungeons and Dragons because of what they heard in the press and what they heard in all these crazy things that were being circulated in mainstream ideas. But they maybe didn't have that Satan component. They weren't ready to go towards that. But the Christians, the evangelicals, definitely were, right? And so they would range across the nation, speaking of demons, spells, mind control, and trying to convince the gullible masses that satanic forces were clearly at work and they needed to open up their eyes and fight this malignant evil. Now, as far as can be determined, the first mention of Dungeons and Dragons as a danger to young people from evangelical sources were a couple lectures really soon after James Egbert's suicide. So remember, he disappeared and that whole thing, and then the private investigator William Deere injected the D&D thing. That's where it connected in the media, right? And then a year later, he kills himself, right? So after several unsuccessful attempts, and then finally he does it about a day after, actually, the 1-year anniversary of his disappearance. So really soon after that, the only evidence that can be found of it, at least written and kind of published and out there, transcribed somehow, were two pastors that really quickly after his suicide kind of leaped on this and brought it to their congregations, audiences, whatever they had going on. That was in 1980, by the way. He killed himself in August of 1980. And so just in the weeks after that, you start to see that leak into now evangelical kind of ideas of Satan entering our culture through insidious means. And this game is one of them, right? This is where it starts. This is the first thing, at least, I mean, maybe someone spoke about it in church before that, but this is the first written account, right, of this happening. And so I want to focus on only one because, they're standard bullshit. But I'm going to take a look at a guy named Albert Dager. I don't know who the fuck he was. He was a pastor somewhere. I don't know if he was influential. I could find very little, but if you do search him, it's pretty much tied to this, right? This is the first time that Dungeons and Dragons became linked to Satan and became a kind of Christian concern in the moral panic in the 1980s. And
Where was he?
Huh?
Where was he at?
I don't even know. I don't care. I didn't look that far into him. Literally, I searched him, and all the first few pages were about him being the first guy to mention Dungeons and Dragons. So it was like, there's just not a lot of info, which, good for him. He's staying off the grid, I guess. Now, right off the bat, in his kind of sermon / essay / warning, right, he makes it clear that the impetus for this sudden interest in Dungeons and Dragons was Dallas's, right? That's what he went by, Dallas's suicide. So here, I'm going to read you from his sermon, okay? Quote, although fantasy war games have been around for some time, it is only recently that they have become a fad, particularly among university and college students. One such game, Dungeons and Dragons, is perhaps the most popular. It received considerable notoriety when the news media reported that it may have been a link in a series of mysterious circumstances surrounding the disappearance and subsequent suicide of University of Michigan. Wrong, it's Michigan State University, but whatever. I won't be a dick about that. James Dallas Egbert. It was suspected that 17-year-old Egbert had fallen victim to traps encountered during a real-life role-playing activity associated with that game in August of 1979. The bizarre circumstances surrounding his disappearance are shrouded in mystery as a result of his subsequent suicide a year later in August 1980. First,
that's what he said in his sermon?
That's what he said in his sermon. This is like literally weeks after he killed himself in 1980. Right?
It's so bogus.
Okay, totally.
We just listened to we're just going through our last podcast.
Right.
Like
so that's why I'm saying, first off, just remember, William Deere knew the truth. Okay, remember, he didn't come forward with it. And he said, because, James Egbert asked him not to, and we could, whatever. Doesn't matter. Go listen to the other episode.
Yeah.
You can hear about that.
Yeah.
But you can see what brought his attention to this issue of Dungeons and Dragons and the evil influence it's having on university students particularly, but children, was the suicide. So this was the thing that sparked the interest of Dungeons and Dragons in the evangelical community, was the suicide, was the disappearance, actually, right? When he was 16, not 17, but he killed himself at 17. Maybe he got that, whatever. But I'm just like, Albert, check your facts, Jesus Christ, But
he's just trying to get an emotional response.
No, totally.
You don't need facts for that.
And we're going to see it build, right? We're going to see he's going somewhere with this.
Just need to talk. You don't need fucking facts. Get people's emotions.
Exactly. So he goes on making a claim that I never heard this one before. And I read quite a bit about Dungeons and Dragons in preparation for this, and kind of, because I don't really know. I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not like in that community. And I didn't really even know where it came from, to be honest. And so I read a bunch of stuff and dove into a lot of kind of research to figure it out. And this is the first time I heard this. And so it kind of piqued my attention. It says, quote, equally bizarre are the circumstances related to Dungeons and Dragons and its part in formulating the idea for a series of mass murders in the Freeway Killer episodes in Southern California. According to the testimony of one of the suspects in those killings, the game was a motivating factor in prompting the actions of him and his accomplices. So what he's saying is, so again, he's building, right? This goes along with the facts thing. We're going to see, he's pulling this out of his ass. I could not find any source that he got this from. And the only relationship I found between a Freeway Killer and Dungeons and Dragons was a movie that came out in 2010. So he wasn't using that, because this is fucking 30 years before that. And so I literally think that he is the seed of this idea. That's my conclusion, because I could not dig up anything where he pulled this from. But I'm like, Freeway Killer. Now, I am super into serial killers. I watch a lot of stuff, listen to a lot of stuff, read a lot of stuff about serial killers. I didn't actually it wasn't a recognizable name to me. Have you ever heard of the Freeway Killer? I mean, when we were kids, did you hear about the freeway killer?
I don't
Because we
know.
would have been kids in Southern
You've
California.
talked to me about it since you've been studying it, so I can't now.
Right, because you're like,
not
oh, yeah, I have.
appear.
'Cause your dumbass has been saying
You've
something.
been talking about it, so of course I have.
Okay, but anyway, it turns out there was actually in the 70s, because he's writing this in 1980, and he's saying that there's something that was happening close enough to this time that people heard about it. You know what I'm saying? They weren't. He's not some historical thing he's talking about, right? So
it was
had
in
to
their
be,
contemporary experience.
yeah, totally. It was recent, right? And so that's the word I was trying.
What?
They were
What
recent.
Words coming out of my mouth. What am I saying?
See, it's fucking lockdown.
Lockdown.
Brain's locked down. And so, but there was actually so I wanted to look at, okay, well, let's look in the time frame just prior, like in the decade prior to, because it would have to be something big enough that people would know, right? And so I actually found out that there was 3 different killers in the 70s who were given that name, from the press, that moniker, the freeway killer. So I'm like, okay, let's check these guys out. And so the first guy's name is Patrick Kearney. He was born September 24th, 1939. He killed as many as 43 people between the years of 1965 and 1977. But remember, D&D didn't even come out until 1974.
Yeah.
So this guy wasn't inspired by the fucking...
Yeah.
And he didn't use accomplices, which were mentioned in his sermon, right? So I'm like, okay, it's not that fucking guy, obviously. So the next guy, his name is Randy Kraft. He was born March 19th, 1945. He would go on to murder 16 young men in Southern California between 1972 and 1983. So again, he's murdering before Dungeons & Dragons came out. And even though the killings that gave him the name the Freeway Killer wouldn't happen until 1976, he didn't have any accomplices either, right? Because most serial killers are kind of solitary, right? It's an anomaly, and it's also very scary when you have a serial killer who can manipulate other people into doing his dark shit, right? So the third guy, though, that was called the Freeway Killer, his name is William Bonin. He was born January 8th, 1947. That's Marnie's birthday. I mean, not 1947, but January 8th.
Well, 47 was the year my mom was born.
Hey, he was a Capricorn. He was an achiever. You'll see. He went after it. Yeah, he was out there. So he was a complete monster who raped, tortured, and brutally murdered at least 21 boys and young men in Southern California during a period from about 1979 to 1980. So it makes sense in this time frame, as this sermon is being written in 1980. These things just had happened.
Yeah.
So they're fresh in people's minds. They would
brutal.
have heard of this.
And it was brutal.
So we're on to something.
Yeah.
He's also suspected of up to 15 other murders for which he was never charged or convicted. So the timeline totally works. He's, started murdering after D&D came out, and sounds cool. And also, he was a kind of unique kind of monster in the sense that he convinced at least 3 different young men to rape, torture, and murder other young men with him. So this guy is
bad.
This is a malignant, being on this planet.
Yeah.
And so I have to assume that this is who he's talking about because it's got the accomplices and the timeline fits.
Yeah.
So we're going to go with that. So I actually went and found out there was a movie made about this guy, and it's called Freeway Killer. Awesome. So it seems to make sense. It was released in 2010. This is the only other place I watched it, and this is the only other place. It's a shitty movie, by the way, but this is the only other place that Dungeons and Dragons and the Freeway Killer, someone called the Freeway Killer, are connected, right? And in the movie, so William Bonin had an accomplice named Vernon Butts, and and he was, from the information about the actual cases back then, not just in the movie, but in the cases, he was a nerdy kid. He was in astrology. He was into shout out.
Those are super nerd.
Totally. He was into magic and fantasy, and of course he was into Dungeons and Dragons because those are the types of people that were into it, right? definitely like in the historical kind of information you can find about the case, Vernon Butts was definitely like a nerd kid who would have been in Dungeons and Dragons. It never mentions that. It never once shows up in any kind of police report, court transcript, none of that shit. And all that stuff's available. It was the fucking late 70s, you know, like it was that kind of Age of Aquarius stuff was happening. And so he was that kind of nerdy kid. And so he definitely could have been in Dungeons and Dragons, but there was no mention of that. But when you watch the 2010 movie, The Freeway Killer, Vernon Butts is portrayed in that movie as a nerdy, dorky kid. In one scene, William Bonin and another one of his accomplices are sitting in Vernon Butts' house, and he's got like a wizard hat on. It's crazy. And he says, I want to teach you how to play Dungeons and Dragons. And so he brings up the game, and I want to show you this. And they're making fun of him the whole time, like, you're such a dork or whatever, you know, and they're not into it. And he gets all pissed off, and they leave, and other shit happens. But that's it.
Yeah.
There's no like, and then they rolled the dice and decided who was going to die. Like Dungeons and Dragons played some role in it, right?
Like they weren't enthralled by it.
Right. So based on the evidence I can find, the only conclusion I can come to is that Albert Dager made this up. This
pastor.
Connection, which entered into the ethos, you know, like a virus spreading through, you know, different, you know, because people heard and read this thing, and it was distributed, and then they met people, and they told people, and they told people, and it literally made its way to a filmmaker who makes a movie and puts into the thing this Dungeons and Dragons, even though it had nothing to do with like why they were killing. The fact that it was in there
They
at
just kind
all.
of tossed it in because it was.
Yeah, and maybe it was just coincidental because we're like, well, you know, it was popular then. He was a nerdy kid, so of course he played it. But I don't know. These are the only two like connection points I can find. So he's just throwing shit out there, right? This is not like real. He didn't read this in a newspaper or like something. This is, I think he fucking made it up, to be honest. Okay, and so anyway, and I do want to say, like, okay, so unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, fuck him, whatever. Vernon Butts, after he pleaded guilty to like 5 counts of capital murder in California, he hung himself like a couple days later. And then William Bonin actually became the first person to be executed by lethal injection in the state of California on February 23rd, 1996. Nice job, California. And I mean, I'm not a huge supporter of the death penalty, but then there's some people you're just like, oh, you gotta go. I'm sorry. You're what are we gonna do? Like, put you in a cage? I mean, let's just erase you. And here's his last words, though. Quote, I would suggest that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did that, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously.
Whoa.
Now notice, he didn't say like, don't play Dungeons and Dragons or Satan will get a hold of you and next thing you know, you'll be killing. He was
just like,
now, I don't believe him. He's a sociopath. He did not mean a thing. This was his last chance to like go out with the upper hand.
A sociopath cares about his own life. And so he was like, shit, I should have thought more because I didn't really care about what I did. But now I'm gonna die.
Right. There's no empathy or anything in this statement, though. It's purely, even that was, I have to believe, is self-serving because he's a fucking abhorrent creature. But one of the main beefs, though, with Dungeons and Dragons that Albert Dager has seems to be that it's like too self-gratifying. It's not humble enough, right? Because, you know, in their, you know, like the whole meek shall inherit the earth and like pride comes before a fall and I'm just, you know, all this haughty spirit before destruction. I can quote the Bible still. It's interesting. So in his view, players are trying to achieve something and competing, which leads to ego trips. So he goes on to say, quote, some endeavors offer a greater temptation for ego to manifest itself in us. However, the next thing to actual defeat of others and self-exaltation as rulers over the vanquished is the voluntary, imaginary role-playing that is offered by such games as Dungeons and Dragons. So basically he's saying, look, we all want to like rise up and conquer people. First of all, what the fuck? But it's like kind of this idea, like the next best thing to literally becoming a despot and just conquering people and ruling over them, and like the ultimate ego trip, becoming like a god almost, is playing this little fantasy game with your nerd friends in the basement somewhere. That's
So
like
wild.
ridiculous false equivalence. But I mean, this is what he's doing, right? He's like building to something. So he's like, it killed this kid. And all of a sudden we became aware of it. And we're like, what's going on? And then the serial killer is using it. Whoa, what's going on there? That's like escalating. And now it's like all, and even if you don't kill, it causes the worst thing ever. Your ego, your pride. You might have some sense of self-sufficiency and success, and like the worst thing
You
ever.
might feel power.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
For shame.
Okay, but the real payoff, though, is in his confirmation of his belief in, like, magical forces, right? And so he says, quote, "The underlying motivation of greed in these quests for treasure is little to reckon with when considering the enjoyment offered in exercising satanic powers that, in reality, do exist." Right? So he's like, that's nothing. I mean, it's next. You're rolling the dice. You're winning in the game. You're kicking ass. It's like, it's exactly the same ego boost as if you were Genghis Khan, right? But that's nothing compared to the enjoyment you get from exercising these very real satanic powers that are, you know, working their way through this game. It's nuts. But at this point, he's led them to this place to like, well, what else is the answer for why that kid killed himself and this person killed a bunch of people, right? They're like, it kind of ties this like evil acts that in the world happened to this thing, and then shows them, I mean, even if it does just little things, it's the worst you can possibly imagine. So then he goes on to warn, quote, "While our minds and actions are centered on the imaginary use of satanic powers," he says, like, quote unquote, imaginary, right? There's like sarcasm there because you fool, Satan real. So while our minds and actions are centered on the, quote, imaginary use of satanic powers, we are at the very least tolerating them, if not actually accepting them. How much further before we embrace them or they embrace us, right? So, I mean, this is pretty standard shit, but you can see this is like the narrative. This is the framework that he's building around the initial stories in the media about D&D. It just started with this kid who was desperate and hurting and psychologically struggling with a gnarly drug addiction, you know, a tale that happens all over the place, unfortunately. But it becomes this like impetus for this thing to grow to where now this guy is flat out saying, hey, Satan is going to get us through these games, right? Satan's going to get your kids through these games. Mm-hmm. Sure, you might be dabbling, you think whatever, but the powers are embracing us. We're not embracing them, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's this, you know, gnarly scare-tastic. So the rest of it, though, it's standard like God's word says blah, 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 you know, and like thou shalt not and all that kind of bullshit. It's the stuff you hear all the time. But here's the ending. Quote, "If you are caught up in anything akin to fantasy role-playing games, I beg you to burn the abominable thing. Give your mind to Christ. Let his mind be in you." Okay, so basically what it's saying is like, don't role-play a half-dwarf cleric. Role-play Jesus in the real world, right? You're just like, fucking what?
That's what people don't understand. That's what they don't understand, the toxicity of this fucking faith. So yeah, exactly, that whole don't put in the mind of anything else but Christ. So
which is such a subjective, nebulous thing that, you know, they just get to weave into whatever. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but to be honest, like, so I bring this up only, not because it's super compelling, but more, it's just like a point on the line of this whole thing. Mm-hmm. It has to get moving at some part, right? Mm-hmm. You know, it starts in this very initial idea and it has a certain reach, but now it's getting picked up in kind of another subculture that's going to kind of turn into this web of transmission of these ideas. Mm-hmm. So that was the original, at least what can be determined by looking through what's available on the internet and shit like that. It's the first time that Dungeons and Dragons was mentioned in the setting of evangelical Christianity as something to be worried about. Right. And he's like, oh, ooh, this kid died and it was tied to Dungeons and Dragons. And then there was a serial killer, which, didn't, but he says use Dungeons and Dragons. And so planting that seed. But again, this guy, this was pre-internet. It wasn't like this went out to the masses or some Facebook post. So it was, your influence bubble was smaller back then. And so the people in his church and the people that they talked to and the concerned moms and the PTAs and then whatever. But it's still rather limited.
Yeah.
What really spread Dungeons and Dragons as far as the Satanic Panic went was a guy who was attached to these other characters that kind of came into the scene. And he had the media machine and they had the message and the kind of hero backstory and everything that he needed. And his name was Jack Chick. Have you ever heard that name before? Chick Tracks. Have you ever heard of that? Mm-mm. That's interesting. So, like in the evangelical church, particularly the more stodgy, conservative, older, like kind of feel of Christianity, Chick tracts were huge. Okay, and so let's talk about him. And he really didn't know that much. He wasn't this guy coming up with this shit. Mm-hmm. He was the vehicle that had the media empire that would spread some stuff that these hucksters came along and fed him, and it's pretty funny. So, virtually every idea about Vatican conspiracies, satanic minions pulling the levers of power, the supposed human sacrifices happening all the time, and the dangers of listening to rock music that have circulated around American evangelicalism is rooted in Jack Chick's publications. Jack Chick, he died, by the way, in 2016. R.I.P. Jack. He was 92, which, hey, good run. I don't support what you did, but whatever. I'm sure you were important to some people. And when I say dominated the evangelical Christian kind of ethos, Chick Publications, which he would later found in 1970, has distributed over 750 million copies of his bullshit around the world in every language you can imagine. Mm-hmm. So this is not like a little organization. This turned into an empire. Mm-hmm. And so Jack, he was actually an independent Baptist.
Oh, grandma.
And that's right. I knew you'd know that. So to those listening, if you don't know what that
had
is.
His tracts or read them.
Right. When someone says Baptist, first of all, there's no such thing as Christianity. There is a wealth of Christianities, right? It's a thing of things. It's not a thing itself. And so in the Baptist world, which is a particular segment of the things, there is a particular kind of Baptist church called Independent Baptist, and they believe shit like women should only wear dresses. The King James Bible is the only true Bible, and all the other ones are spreading heresy and sodomy and all kinds of crazy shit. It's a very strict form.
Separation. They literally in their ads they'll say separated. King James version only. They'll make this list, but and then they say separated, meaning they're separate from the world. They live in a way that makes it clear that they don't agree with the way the world is.
Right. Loosely translated to, I'm going to be different than you to show you my disdain for you by demonstrating how bad you are. Mm-hmm. It's quite an interesting group, but here's the interesting thing is Jack was not religious growing up. He wasn't a Christian. He wasn't raised in a Christian home. He wasn't a Christian in high school. He wasn't a Christian in his service in World War II, which he went and fought as a hero over in World War II. I don't know what the fuck he did, but he served over there. Still wasn't religious. Mm-hmm. But he comes back from the war in 1946 and he meets a hot young woman. Mm-hmm. And that is how they get you. Mm-hmm. Every single time when I hear of an adult person, it usually doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, but a lot of times it's a man. When they say they start going to church or become a Christian later in life, when they weren't raised that way, I know they want to fuck somebody, right? There's somebody that they need to do
my
this
grandparents
for.
were married and fucking, and they became Christians at 30. They weren't raised in religion. They didn't, and they became independent Baptists as adults. It wasn't about fucking. There are other... it's either that or it's some kind of trauma.
True. I still say, if you're dating a girl and she says, sure, I'll marry you if you join my religion, run. There's other girls. Get away. But anyway, Jack Chick fell for that trap, and so she introduced him to her fundamentalist Christian family that were these independent Baptists. And now, he was a cartoonist in the 1950s, and he really, really wanted to like spread the gospel, right? But super shy. He was really shy. He didn't like to talk to people. He was afraid of talking to people. A lot of people didn't really know him because he just wasn't out there. He communicated from behind this wall of like media, of comic books. He put out full-length comic books that were kind of like rip-offs of other comic books out there from Marvel and DC and all the various things, but they had a Christian message and a Christian, like he was kind of that guy. Today he'd be behind a computer somewhere, posting stuff and not being seen in public. He was kind of that guy. And so now he did hear like from a friend who was a missionary over in China or some shit that, oh man, the Communist Party has just been able to brainwash this whole country through comic books. Like, don't put out, like they learned, like, don't put out these long text things or huge letters or big documents, but put out comic books, and it just helped like spread the communist message throughout China. And so Jack Chick's like, that's how I'm going to do it. That's how I'm going to spread the gospel and teach people about Jesus and all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so in 1970, he founds Chick Publications, and what would follow was, pretty much everything in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that the conspiracies are in the church, whether it be the Pope's the Antichrist or the Vatican is secretly satanic or, all these things, Dungeons and Dragons, certainly rock music, all of these different ways that Satan was supposedly really sprang from Chick Publications, from Jack Chick's comic books and his stuff that he's putting out, his tracks. And that information came from con men of just the highest order. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Obvious con men approaching people who want to believe so bad. And he ends up really shaping the mind of the superstitious Christian church through this period. And so the first guy that comes on the scene, his name was Alberto Rivera. He claimed to be a Jesuit priest turned fundamentalist activist who influenced Chick against the Catholic Church. His account of his upbringing is nothing short of a superhero origin story, complete with avenging his dead mother, infiltrating the Catholic Church, being tortured and poisoned until he had to be placed in an iron lung in a secret psychiatric hospital. But luckily, in the end, he asked Jesus for forgiveness, and bam, he was healed, right? And so one thing you will find with these people that come selling these stories, Jack Chick didn't have any kind of interaction with the satanic this or any kind of occultic associations or any experience that he could like leverage.
Yeah.
It was all brought by these people. And when these people come, they always have this kind of mythical origin story. Right. In the case of Alberto Rivera, he claimed that, his mother, they were raised in this around this Jesuit monastery or whatever. And his mother was dying in the hospital that these priests ran. And he witnessed his mother die while she's telling him that demons are coming to kill her and to get out of here because the Jesuits are evil and they're satanic. And there was this whole thing. Right. And so he grows up and decides to infiltrate the Jesuit order, become one, to kind of like undo it from within. But they like found out. And so they start torturing him and trying to brainwash him. And they end up getting him so bad, like he said, he ends up in an iron lung and and it's this whole kind of woven thing that absolutely didn't happen, but kind of points to like something fucked up might have happened.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, did he get touched by a priest or like there's all kinds of things.
I think so. His mom died and she's telling him stories.
According to him, first of all, we don't know that
his mom died.
No, we know his mom died because his mom's old, but We don't know that any of this happened, right? This is the story he told. So then to say his mom died in this way already is a little bit shady.
We don't know.
Well, no. Why? No. They don't have the transcription of his mom's death because she was just some woman that lived in. She was nobody. This guy wasn't important, and nothing like this happened.
So maybe his mom died, and we have a schizophrenic guy that lives across the street from us, so I'm very familiar with the delusions, and things that are happening with someone that's not okay in the mind. So, he's either something traumatic happened to him, or he's delusional, or both, and it triggered the delusions.
Could be, but let's go on and see what you think here in a little bit, okay? So he fed Chick all kinds of conspiracy theories about how the Vatican was filled with Masonic/Satanic, it was kind of the same thing to him, cabals, bent on destroying real Christians and all morality. However, in reality, Rivera had a long history of legal entanglements, which included fraud, credit card theft, and writing bad checks, okay? This guy is a grifter. He tells stories for a living to get money out of people who will believe him. That was Jack Chick in this case. Okay, this guy made money doing this. He didn't share these stories for free. He went round to churches preaching this probably fantastical story that he's using to get donations to support his ministry against the Catholic Church. But he kind of is one of the... It's not that people didn't consider the Catholic Church evil ever since the Reformation, when Martin Luther, all that stuff, the Catholic Church obviously held, from their vantage point, a adversarial position, right?
Yeah.
But in the modern context of how today people think that the Vatican is evil and probably under the, kind of command of Satan, comes from this, okay? At least largely in part, it comes from this.
Yeah.
So like all grifters, Alberto claimed to have all kinds of degrees and accomplishments that could not possibly fit into the timeline he provided. Eventually, after being arrested, Rivera admitted he had received those degrees from a diploma mill in Colorado, which is a place where you just go pay money and they give you a diploma that says whatever you want it to say on there. So this guy is a con man through and through.
Yeah. Which
means you cannot try and find some reality in this story because it didn't happen. So here's from Wikipedia. I want to read you this. Quote, Rivera claimed that the Jesuit order was responsible for the creation of communism, Islam, interesting, Nazism, and causing both world wars, all the recessions, the Jonestown Massacre, and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, who was a Catholic, by the way. Rivera further claims that the Catholic Church wants to spread homosexuality and abortion, which you see that happening all the time, obviously. And he further claimed that the popes are antichrists and that the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon, which is the church that we grew up in once we got into a funkier kind of set of fundamentalist evangelicals. There were books that Marnee and I read in our 20s that older Christians typically gave to us that definitely taught us that the Vatican and the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon, and the Pope is the Antichrist, and a world leader is going, or he was the false prophet, or some kind of fucking shit. And it comes from this, okay? It comes from this kind of...
That's what I always... that's what's interesting to me about looking into this stuff. Because when we were in religion, there was so many teachings that you're like, where did that come from? It's because it's not written in the Bible, and then there's just these things, these traditions of teachings that you had taken for granted. They were always around you, and that was just the answer that was given, and you're like, okay. And later, as we're questioning everything, I was like, where did that even start? And so this is interesting to look at. This is a lot of the things came from this one guy.
Yes, and it's going to get so much better. There's a story coming up that is the best story. I love it. But anyway, that was Alberto Rivera. he really fed Jack Chick a lot of the anti-Catholic stuff. That was his angle. And again, knowing what we know today, I'm like, this dude got molested by a Jesuit priest. I'm sorry. That's what I feel like. I'm not saying that. I don't want to, I don't even know. I don't know if he's still alive. I didn't even look, but I don't want to libel him or anything like that. But it feels like that, because he literally spent his whole life, yes, grifting and conning, but the hook was around the Catholic Church being evil.
He had some trauma with them.
And he kept singling out the Jesuit order, right? Which is only one fucking order within the church. We live in Spokane. Gonzaga University is a Jesuit university. They hit pedophiles over the last few decades, so fuck all of them. We don't care about them. But he definitely had a hard-on for the Jesuits for some reason, and I don't know. But we'll leave Alberto Rivera there because he was kind of run-of-the-mill con man, right? The next couple guys are fantastic. So the next guy, John Wayne Todd, was born in 1949. He shows up in 1968, married to a woman named Linda, preaching and claiming he had been a witch while in the Navy, but then converted to Christianity in a Pentecostal church in Southern California. This is during the Jesus movement in Southern California, when all the hippies who were kind of waking up from their kind of acid trips and their free love kind of stuff. Things hadn't really changed. Life was moving on without them. All this, kind of drastic revolution didn't really happen, even though they did change things and they did have impact. When you're young and idealistic and you want it all and some won't do, a lot of them turned to cults, and a lot of them, the cult they turned to was Christianity. That's right. And it was known as the Jesus movement. It was very famous. There are so many things out there about it. But John Wayne Todd kind of shows up right when this is getting going in 1968, which is the summer of love. So like the hippie movement's about to crash. And he shows up claiming that he had been a witch and all this kind of shit. He then disappears for a few months, only to return without Linda, his wife, claiming that God had told him to seek other mates, because that's big on God's big on this kind of thing. He's like, you two were married, but you know what? Go find someone else. Divorce is like always big with God. Everyone knows that. In reality, John Todd had knocked up Linda's teenage sister while they were somewhere. Gosh. And so she bailed on him because he's a fucking asshole. In 1969, he joined the army and wound up stationed in Germany. It was only a few months before he got into some trouble and was discharged for psychiatric issues and drug abuse. Of course, his story is that he actually had killed an officer, but had gotten off scot-free because the Illuminati had used their infiltration of the government to cover for him. Which is so great. I love these guys' ability to just commit to these roles, but there are army records. I saw them. They're public. That he was kicked out for drug abuse and all this kind of shit. And disciplinary issues. He just was a fucking unruly dude that was crazy, and they had to get rid of him. But I love the story. It's like, no. See, here's the deal. They're not telling you this. They're covering it up. Now, listen, every fucking conspiracy going on today, right now, does the same thing right here. Yeah, that's what they're telling you. But come on. The truth is, I killed this officer. And because of my clout with the Illuminati and because I've been initiated into the secret society, and thus they're my brothers and they have my back, they got me out, and I wasn't. So yeah, that's a cover that they had to give me because they had to make it sound good. They couldn't just say that I'm super important and that, of course, I could do whatever I want. And I'm out because of this. So it's just nonsense. But anyway, by 1972, he is a minor celebrity in the Jesus movement that was spreading throughout the disillusioned hippies emerging from their LSD trips in Southern California. However, soon allegations arose that he had been making sexual advances toward teenage girls. Not cool. They're not really into that in the Jesus movement at this time. He was incorporating witchcraft into his Bible studies. Super not into that, right? They're not into that. He was carrying a .38 caliber handgun into church meetings. Now, today, they would be totally cool. Yeah. But these were hippies. Yeah. In fucking 1972, they were not cool with you walking in with a gun into church. Yeah. Using drugs and, of course, the aforementioned impregnation of his wife's teenage sister. So they had this long list of like, dude, we found some things out about you and noticed some things about you. Like the witchcraft, for instance. We got an issue with that, you know? And so they kind of kick him out of the movement. He's kind of shamed, right? And so in 1974, he bails to Dayton, Ohio. I don't know why. I don't know if that's where he grew up or something, but he ends up, I mean, I could never imagine going, dude, let's move to Dayton, but like that's what he did. And so from 1974 to 1977, he moves to Dayton where he runs an occult bookstore and leads a Wiccan coven. Okay. This is true. This actually happened. There's newspaper articles and fucking, we'll get there. But this happened.
Okay.
He referred to this later as, quote, a period of backsliding, which is my favorite. If you don't know that term in Christianity, backsliding is when you get away from the guilt and the rules of the church and you just act like who you are. And then that's called backsliding, right? And so backsliding is when you like, oh, shit, I went back to having sex with the girls I meet in bars. When I stopped doing that when I came to church, that's backsliding. In this case, backsliding was running a coven and having an a cult bookstore. So during this time, he was accused of having underage girls take part in sexual initiation rites for his coven.
This is a pattern.
Yeah. A neo-pagan organization in town performed an investigation that uncovered drug use and underage sex. They turned him in, and John wound up being convicted and serving 2 months of a 6-month sentence, released due to epileptic fits. So, interesting. Couple things interesting. One, notice that these, I guess what Christians would call Satanists, like neo-pagans, right? Because they're kind of like, if you're not on our team, you're on his team. It doesn't matter what you call yourself. They turned him in.
Yeah.
And put him in jail for doing this shit. We have experiences in the church where we outright told other churches this person is a fucking predator, a pedophile, a danger to people, and they did nothing.
Yeah.
Crazy, right? These evil pagans that are doing the right thing. Interesting. But he gets thrown in jail, and, whatever. I never saw any other mention of him having epilepsy, so I don't know if he, faked it or some shit. I don't know. I might be making that, but I just imagine that. But he gets out after 2 months. He was going to serve 6. And he heads back to California, right? He figures some time has passed. It's 1977 now. So in late 1977, he shows back up on the Christian scene in Southern California. Now he was claiming that a vast satanic conspiracy was being led by the Illuminati. They included satanic witches such as Billy Graham, of course, Jim Baker, I totally buy that.
Yeah.
Jerry Falwell, absolutely. And Pat Robertson. All these guys are dickholes who I don't care about, but they were huge in the Christian scene at this time. Now we have some distance. Now, Billy Graham never had any scandals or whatever. I'm sure there's shady shit. He just whatever. But the other ones have all had bullshit, and they've all been exposed or whatever. But back then, these were superstars of this form of Christianity. Yeah. And so to accuse them of satanic witches was like accusing the pantheon, of evil. He claimed that he had given Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel $8 million.
I know that guy.
Yeah, we do. He claimed that he had given Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel $8 million on behalf of the satanic cabal to launch the Christian rock music industry as a tool to lure young people to the dark side through demonic beats. Now, we grew up in a time where people would come speak to us at Christian youth conferences and camps and stuff, and they would talk to us about how, well, actually, these are ancient African drum beats. It's always telling that it's African, by the way. But anyway, ancient African drum beats that are meant to put you into a trance so that evil spirits can take over or tell you to do shit or brainwash you. And so all of this came from fucking this cat. Now, I was a pastor in the Calvary Chapel movement, which is the movement that Chuck Smith founded during the Jesus movement based off of a bunch of Jesus movement hippies.
So funny that, little connections, because my grandma, the Independent Baptist one, came to visit us and went to my church. That was a Calvary Chapel that was based from Chuck Smith, and we had the evil Christian music that had drum beats and acoustic guitars and rock. I want to say she would say rock and roll, but it wasn't. So, it was like folk music.
I know. The things that they really get nervous about is funny.
She just thought it was awful. And she was praying for my church, and she sent the pastor a hymnal,
Yeah.
and praying that he would come back to the
Yeah.
truth of the gospel.
Yeah. That's great. But so John Todd on his return. Now remember, this is after he's fucking knocked up his wife's teenage sister, been thrown out of the Jesus movement for all kinds of bullshit.
Yeah.
Goes to Dayton, runs a witches' coven and a occult bookstore where he's accused of convincing underage girls to have sex with him as his initiation rites.
Your brain's not okay. His brain's
know.
not okay.
Oh, I
This
forgot
isn't
that
just
he
like
did time
normal
in prison.
person
Yeah.
making up stories. Like, his brain is not okay to live a life like that.
I know, and this not okay brain is influencing the satanic panic around this stuff, and he's getting to Dungeons and Dragons. So just hold on, because that's where it really gets good. He also said he was JFK's personal warlock, and he was still alive, by the way. Right? JFK faked his own death; it was all a fake. And that this guy
like,
was
no,
JFK's personal warlock. Okay,
Confused me there for a minute. I was like, wait,
He
no,
said-
he's dead.
actually, Jimmy Carter is the actual Antichrist.
Oh.
Which I'm like, fuck off, dude. Okay, first of all, if Jimmy Carter is representing Satan, then hail Satan, we're doing that. Because he's the only one out of all of them doing anything constructive for anybody. God, Jimmy Carter. But remember, back then he was president.
Yeah.
And whoever's in charge, you know,
they're
is
like
the
evil.
fucking, yeah.
We hate him.
Yeah. Until today, when all of a sudden he's fucking God Emperor Trump. I don't know what happened. But back then, if you were in charge, you were automatically the Antichrist. Even if you were a kind-hearted Southern peanut farmer who just wanted to build houses for poor people. I don't fucking understand any of that. And he also began telling Christians to stockpile food and weapons, still going on today, by the way, just under different guises, for the coming satanic takeover, which was going to occur in 1980. Didn't happen, obviously, but I mean, this is like the seed of all of the shit you see going on today in the Christian church around apocalyptic thinking, storing food, all of this stuff kind of got churning at this time, okay? With a lot of new information being provided by a lot of people that were just simply con men, grifters, and dangerous, some of them like this guy. Okay, but in 1984, John Todd collaborated with Jack Trick on a tract called Dark Dungeons, and this is really where the satanic panic around Dungeons and Dragons got going. Okay, remember it was 1979 when the disappearance happened of Dallas Egbert, and so now we're 5 years later. Dungeons and Dragons has kind of pushed its way into the ethos. There's cartoons. There's a lot of people are playing it, and John Todd, this kind of crusader against the Illuminati, comes along and gets hooked up with Jack Chick somehow, and they write this tract, and this is essentially what happens it's a comic book kind of form, right? It's a little comic book. So a group of girls are playing Dark Dungeons, which is just Dungeons and Dragons. They just couldn't use that because they'd sue the fuck out of them, under the tutelage of a dark-haired, seductive woman mentor. Always, right? It's always a woman, because you're like, oh, well, Eve was the one that was tempted.
Yes.
And she's dark-haired and sexy and hot, and of course we're going to do what she tells us to do. So a girl named Marcy's character in the opening kind of part of the comic book, they're playing this game, Dark Dungeons. And a girl named Marcy's character, Blackleaf, that's her name, the character's name, dies, and she totally freaks out, right? And it's starting this thing of like, oh, I can't, tell the difference. I'm so bummed out over my character dying. The main character, Debbie, is told by the seductress that she is now ready to gain real satanic magical powers because she's proven herself in the game, right? So, like, the game was just like a trial to see, like, do you have the talent to really receive satanic powers? And so then some stuff happens, and the next thing you know, Debbie comes to tell the seductress, the woman that's kind of training her, she's like, oh, I totally did what you said. My dad didn't want me to play Dark Dungeons anymore, but then I cast a mind bondage spell on him, and the next thing you know, he bought me a whole bunch of expensive characters and shit for the game, and I'm just like, oh. First of all, in 2020, like a mind bondage spell on daddy totally has a different connotation, right? If you Google that, there's going to be all kinds of crazy shit. But basically the idea was like she has real powers now, right? She can really like do this. Meanwhile, Marcy hangs herself over the loss of Blackleaf, okay? So they show this thing where it's just her feet kind of like hanging or whatever. And, Debbie comes across her and sees her and freaks out, and she runs away because now she's like, what did I get myself into? And she's sitting under a tree all by herself, just like, what do I do? And so she comes across a clean-cut, varsity, square-jawed young man who brings her to church service where a former witch was speaking and freeing people from demons. And this guy is based off of John Wayne Todd, this motherfucker, right? He's the character that ends up in here. And so this guy, he's white, of course, and a football player and like the whole ideal or whatever. And so he invites her to church where she's going to hear this message. And so, of course, she accepts Jesus. And it all ends with this preacher telling them to burn all your shit, right? And it shows them throwing their Dark Dungeons characters in and doing all the shit, right? Yeah. And it's him. It's John Todd that it's representing. It's very clear. It looks like him and everything. So... here's the thing. That tract is still published by Chick Publications. It's still put out by the thousands and thousands and thousands of copies. It was actually updated in 2013. That was just 7 years ago. The only thing they really changed was Marcy hangs herself in pants now, which is progressive. If you think about it. You're like, hey, she had a skirt on before. They put pants on her. Yeah, like skinny jeans, like she was rocking it.
Well, it's got to show that you wear those pants and you're going to commit suicide.
I don't think it was as much that as like we've got to like somehow relate to
women.
Impressionable young people again. And Debbie gets some fresh new looks too. Her clothes are all updated a little bit. But that's about it. It still has the same message. It still is telling you that Dungeons and Dragons will lead you to kill yourself, cast spells on your parents, all this kind of shit, unless you accept Jesus and burn all your stuff, which is crazy shit. But that is exactly what we were told to do as Christian teens in the fucking 80s. I was. Like, it happened. So, in 1987, John Todd was arrested for raping a college student and was then charged with additionally molesting 2 kids from a karate school he worked at. He got 30 years, but was released to a psychiatric hospital for dangerous criminals in 2004, where he died in 2007. This chick tract would come to define much of the evangelical view of Dungeons and Dragons and continues to do so to this day.
It's wild that they would like not follow the history of the guy who gave them this story.
Oh, they don't do that.
And then go, maybe we should...
Because no one even knew this is where it came from. Right? They just heard something.
The Chick Tract company doesn't? The Chick Publications?
Oh, they do, but they're making fuck them. They don't. They have so many motives involved in this. They don't give a shit about what's true or not anymore. But people hearing it, they didn't go far. I mean, some people did and went, "Oh, this is nonsense," but most people, no. They don't do that. And so we're going to talk about one more guy though. Maybe my favorite within this guy's story is one of my favorite stories I think I've ever come across, right? His name is William Schneeblen. He's still a big guy in the Christian YouTube conspiracy kind of world or whatever. He still puts plenty of shit up there. He's claiming all kinds of new nonsense. But this dude has a storied past that intersects with Dungeons & Dragons as well. So I'm going to read to you from Joseph Laycock's Dangerous Games about this guy. Quote, in his 1993 book, Lucifer Dethroned, William Schneeblen claimed to be a former satanic high priest, a Wiccan, an old Catholic bishop, a Mormon elder, and a literal blood-drinking vampire. He also claimed that he had personally used Dungeons & Dragons to recruit college students into satanic worship. By 2001, Schneeblen was claiming to have helped design D&D. He explained, quote, in the late 1970s, a couple of game writers actually came to my wife as prominent sorcerers in the community, because you always know where they live. They wanted to make certain the rituals were authentic. For the most part, they are. Okay, so this guy, he's wild. Okay, this guy's all over the place.
Apparently, how are you any or all of those things that he claimed to be? That's the thing.
That's all of these people. This is the thing.
People just want to believe anything. If you would just listen to that list of things.
Because it's just about...
You'd just be like, all right, done with you. As soon as you listed all those things, I'm like, and we're done. I'm not...
Right. So, like, he literally claimed to be, like, the head warlock of Geneva, Wisconsin, or wherever the fuck it was.
And a vampire.
We'll get to that. Because that's a fun story, too. or like fun little detail about his backstory. And this is all provided by him, by the way. Okay, so this is him weaving this fantastic tale of heroism that he's obviously trying to project. So he claims, yes, I was the lead warlock of Lake Geneva, I think it's Wisconsin, and the D&D guys, they came to me because I was the head warlock in town. Of course they're gonna come to me because I know all that shit, and say like, hey, are these spells correct? Because we want to make sure that when you invoke the forces of Satan, they really invoke the forces of Satan, right? And he's like, for the most part, they are, and all this kind of shit. Here's the deal. First of all, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, the two guys who created Dungeons & Dragons, they were both Christians.
Yeah.
Gary Gygax was a Jehovah's Witness for quite a while. Mm-hmm. These guys were not making sure their spells were real. Mm-hmm. Okay, that was not. It was all about adventure and fantasy and fun to them. Mm-hmm. But it created this base material for this dude to start saying shit about. And they up and down said this did not happen, TSR and all this stuff. But this guy still claims it, and Christians still believe it today. So he claimed that he joined the Church of Satan, but it wasn't hardcore enough for him. Okay, first of all, the Church of Satan is a bunch of goths who were drama majors or something, and they didn't make it, and so now this is their. I mean, it's just a fun club, right? I'm a member of the Church of Satan. I paid a small fee because I wanted access to their library, and so I'm like, fuck it. And so like $30, I was in. It's not like you're worshiping Satan in there. Anyway. But he claimed like, it wasn't hardcore enough for me. It wasn't dark enough. So I joined the darkest organization I can imagine, the Freemasons, which are always a great target, right?
I know.
When these guys are just sitting around getting drunk, doing their stupid rituals, I don't know, sucking each other's dicks probably. Like they're just having a good time. So he says, well, because the Church of Satan was not cool enough, not hardcore enough, we weren't doing evil enough shit, I joined the Freemasons. And within the Freemasons, he claims to have been indoctrinated into the Palladian Order, okay? And this is a mythical order of Freemasons that does not exist. It is a admitted hoax, but this motherfucker still claims it today because no one will go to the next step and go, is this real? And so now I did, and I will tell you this story that I'm in love with this person, this guy, okay? This isn't not William Schnoblin, but the guy at the center of this Palladian order of Freemasons.
The guy who started the hoax?
Yes.
Oh.
And this is a great story. I'm going to tell you the story, okay? Oh, my God. So Marie Joseph Gabrielle Antoine Jogan Paget, it's like, Jesus fucking Christ, yeah, was a 19th century freethinker in France, obviously, right?
Yes.
And a funny dude who liked to stir shit up. He wrote pornographic stories in serial form. So you know what that means? That means like, and as Joe put his cock into our, join us next week as we, like serialized form where like one thing leads to another. So he made
a radio show?
No, I think it was publication. It was magazines or whatever. But you had to wait to get the next one to see what happened. Can you imagine how frustrating porn would have been back then? You're like, I was so close. But I don't know where he was going to put his hand. I got to wait till fucking next week or whatever. So he wrote porn in serial form. He hated authority and dogma, especially those that were religious in nature. And he fucking hated Roman Catholicism. And so he wrote a book under the pen name Leo Taxil, and that's kind of the name he goes by from then on. So he turns
much simpler.
Yeah, no shit. So under the name Leo Taxil, he writes a book called The Secret Loves of Pope Pius IX as a joke in 1890, right? Because he's like hates the Catholic Church and he writes porn, and he's like Pope porn, right? It's obviously the thing to do. So he puts out this book in 1890. And the fucking church went nuts. They obviously didn't like it, right? And so in 1891, he claims that a Palladian order of Freemasons exists who worship Satan. Now, apparently he had joined the Freemasons and they'd kind of kicked him out or something like that because he was doing all this nonsense with the Catholic Church. And so he kind of was like, fuck you, Freemasons. So he's going to throw them in the mix too. And so he creates this idea that there's a secret order, a darker, nefarious order within the Freemasons called the Palladian Order, right? In 1892, so the next year, collaborating with a co-author named Dr. Carl Hacks, who he made up completely. So he's Carl Hacks also in this book. He's writing from two different voices, right? Taxel propped up this invented conspiracy in a book called The Devil in the 19th Century, in which he claimed that the Paladists were based in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't know why, but that's where he decided. Over there in America,
like,
that's where they are.
Over there in Charleston.
So in this book, The Devil in the 19th Century, he introduces a character named Diana Vaughn, and she is supposedly a descendant from a legendary Rosicrucian alchemist and a current high priestess of the Palladian Order of Masons, a satanic witch. And so he invents this woman who's like grown up being groomed for this role. Her dad was this occultic master, and now she's a satanic witch, and she's been trained and stuff, and so now she's this high priestess in the Palladian Order of the Freemasons, even though the Freemasons don't admit women, but she was, right? She tells of encounters and interactions with incarnate demons. One wrote prophecies on her back with his tail, which I read that and I was like, oh, hot. Like, you can see where his like porn stuff comes in, because he's just like, oh, people would like that maybe. Another one played piano in the form of a crocodile. We'll get to all this. The current Pope, Leo the 13th, was super pissed off about all this and publishes an encyclical. So an encyclical is basically, I'm mad, and so God's saying this to stop it. Basically, it's from the Pope, right? So on April 20th, 420, 1894, he releases a encyclical called Humanum Genus, because they were still fucking speaking Latin in 1894, apparently. But it means the human race. And in the encyclical, this is what he says. Quote, Pope Leo saying this: separated into two diverse and opposite parts, of which the one steadfastly contends for truth and virtue, the other of those things which are contrary to virtue and truth. The one is the kingdom of God on earth, namely the true church of Jesus Christ. He's saying us, obviously, we're the good guys. The other is the kingdom of Satan. At this period, however, the partisans of evil seem to be combining together and to be struggling with united vehemence, led on or assisted by that strongly organized and widespread association called the Freemasons. So in response to this nonsense that this guy is just pumping out because he thinks it's funny, the Pope writes an official letter saying, I'm speaking with the authority of fucking Peter, right? Which is serious in their religion.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever, it's nothing, but it's serious to them. Saying, all right, here's the deal. There's two teams. There's fucking us, the good guys, and there's all these Satanists, which are usually all disorganized and crazy or whatever, but now the Freemasons have united them together, to just like go against the forces of good. It's just hilarious, right? So as Diana, our hero, Leo Taxel, undergoes a publicized fake conversion to the Roman Catholic Church and says she vows to undo the damage she had done to the truth. Diana, Leo, then publishes a collection of prayers that the Pope publicly praises. So now this guy basically makes this fictional character he created renounce her Satanism, become a Catholic, and then he publishes a book of prayers under this fake character, written by a fake character that he made up, right? So it's like layers of this. Yeah. And the Pope praises it and says, basically, he gets behind it. Because she's an ex-satanic witch who's now accepted that's the best story.
I know, but the Pope is believing she's a real person.
Oh, yeah, totally. Everybody is. Yeah. Everybody is. Because this is a world where you read shit in newspapers and books and pamphlets. Right. He then calls Leo, Marie Page, but his pen name Leo. He then calls a press conference to introduce Diana Vaughn to the world in the flesh on April 19th, 1897. Instead, it just turned out to be Leo, who proceeded to explain it was all a hoax to embarrass the church as they believed his wild claims. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So he has this press conference. He's like, I'm gonna introduce you to her. And he gets up and he says, look, dude, I made it all up. Yeah. I was just fucking with you guys and whatever. 6 days later, a newspaper in Paris printed his confession in full under the title. Listen to this title. This is back then, things were different. This is the newspaper article title, right? 12 years under the banner of the church. The Prank of Palladism, Miss Diana Vaughan, The Devil at the Freemasons, a conference held by M. Leo Taxil at the Hall of the Geographic Society in Paris. I'm like, fuck. After reading that, I'd be like, I'm not reading this. The rest of it.
You just
like,
told me.
Who cares? But check this out. I love this quote. So years later, in an interview in 1906, Taxil said this, quote, "The public made me what I am, the arch liar of the period. For when I first commenced to write against the Masons, my object was amusement, pure and simple. The crimes I laid at the door were so grotesque, so impossible, so widely exaggerated. I thought nobody would see the joke and give me credit for originating a new line of humor. But my readers wouldn't have it so. They accepted my fables as gospel truth, and the more I lied for the purpose of showing that I lied, the more convinced became they that I was a paragon of veracity. Then it dawned on me that there was lots of money in being a Munchausen of the right kind, and for 12 years I gave it to them hot and strong, but never too hot. When indicting such slush as the story of the devil snake who wrote prophecies on Diana's back with the end of his tail, I sometimes said to myself, hold on, you're going too far. But I didn't. My readers even took kindly to the yarn of the devil who, in order to marry a Mason, transformed himself into a crocodile and despite the masquerade, played the piano wonderfully well." He's like, when I started this, I thought, everyone's going to see that I'm fucking around. It's a joke.
Yeah.
And they're all going to go like, oh, this is great. You've just like created a whole new kind of comedy.
So he was trying to, so then he was like, they believe this, and he's trying to get more and more outrageous to make it more obvious that he's lying, and they believed it every time even farther.
And then he found out I could make money off of this. And that's when he's like, I thought, this is going too far. If I say this, they'll never believe it.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. We will fucking believe anything. And so I love that story. Now, all of that is just to say that's the dude who invented the Palladian Order. And William Schnoblin, still to this day on YouTube, claims to be a member of the Palladian Order of the Freemasons. But no one would ever go look and see this, track down the story. Yeah. Which I love this guy. If I do go to heaven or whatever, I hope I meet him one day because I feel like he should have lived now. He'd have been fucking awesome. But let's get back to William because there's other things he's claimed besides this, right? He claimed that he made a deal with Satan himself that gave him superpowers for 7 years but cost him his soul. His spirit guides helped him get into the Illuminati, sure. Mm-hmm. He's spoken to ascended masters and the spirits of Jesus. And this is what's interesting to me. Most people, when they say this, they'll go, I spoke to Jesus, Buddha, Krishna. You know, they'll start naming the good guys.
The ascended masters.
This guy goes, I spoke to ascended masters like Jesus, Hitler, what the fuck? And Aleister Crowley. I'm like, okay. That's a weird crew.
The ascended masters.
Jesus rolling with Hitler and Aleister Crowley. I don't know. But that's what he says. He had sex with a fallen angel, so I know what his fucking web history looks like. That's what he claims, that he had sex with a fallen angel, which just means he yanks it hoping to have sex with a fucking demon woman. He then became a Catholic priest, thanks to him being down with Satan, because they're all Satanists. So, like, because he could come to them and say, I'm a real Satanist, because I'm in the Palladian Order of Freemasons, they totally accepted him, because that's the Catholic Church is that way. He then was faced with a choice to either become a vampire or a werewolf. So it's like Edward versus Jacob situation. All right. He chose vampire, Team Edward, right? And so for years he claims he was only able to live off of blood and communion crackers. And you're like, why communion crackers? Well, because in the Roman Catholic Church, Satanists using satanic magical powers, they believe that the priest has the power to literally transform that cracker into the literal flesh. So technically, it's still vampire food when you get it the right way.
Yeah.
Right. And he says garlic and sunlight hurt him and all the cliches. Some anonymous Christian prayed for him apparently, and his powers vanished forever. Which, by the way, if anyone's out there praying that my superpowers go away, fucking stop it. Right. Why would you do that? And who found out like that he had superpowers anyway? An anonymous person prayed that his superpowers would go away, and he did. And then he became a Mormon because they're a bunch of Satanists also. That's big in his book. And then at this point, he finally reads the Bible and he gets saved, renouncing his evil ways on June 22nd, 1984. Now, today, in more modern times, he claims to be a deep operative in the U.S. intelligence. He claims to be an expert on long-range nuclear missiles, on bioweapons. I guarantee you he's saying shit about coronavirus and that he's somehow plugged into this thing. This is a con man who literally cannot stop himself, and people will buy his shit like you wouldn't believe, right?
Yeah. What's his name?
His name's William Schnoebelen. He's the guy who claimed to be the fucking lead sorcerer in the neighborhood where D&D was made, and so he's the guy that, they came asking to make sure the spells were real. Mm-hmm. So one thing that you'll find with all of these hucksters is that they never just have some regular levels. They're never like a regular Satanist. They're never like a minion. They're never like, well, I just fucking clean the bathrooms, at the satanic whatever complex. They're always high priests. They're always like some crazy thing. And it's just like, look, if all of you guys are in charge, no wonder nothing's fucking happening, right? Because you don't have any minions. You're all just a bunch of high priests. You're super important, this or that. And that's what you find in a lot of these things, right? People coming at you with this, I have the truth because I have these mythical experiences that I'm making up, okay? But because you're not going to look into that or consider that, he gets a probably good success rate on people going like, whoa, I should listen to what you have to say. But these are the people that formed the kind of Christian evangelical response that began to kind of churn around and really begin to form. And so I wanted to talk about these guys because, so like you said, so often we hear these things and we think, oh, they must come from somewhere.
Yeah.
There must be some truth to this.
Yeah.
There's not, though.
Yeah.
There really isn't. There's a bunch of people with an ability to convince people of shit and a desire to get one over on them for whatever reason, whether it be money or to feel good about themselves or power or influence or I don't know. And then there's just a whole lot of people ready to buy whatever they're fucking told. And especially if they're told from some authoritative place like church, and we need to be careful. These same things are going on now. We can look back at this and go, how silly. But, I mean, there's shit in our world that people believe that come from people just like this all the time, every day. So that's where we'll end up this one. Next episode, we'll talk about kind of the more social response because these people weren't doing a lot, right? The Christians weren't really doing a lot. Yeah, they were like fucking making their Christian teens feel guilty or telling them all this bullshit at camp. But, like, they weren't out there trying to get things changed that much in the world. Just their own world, right?
Yeah.
But there were people who absolutely were out there as moral entrepreneurs, that are called, right? Moral causes that they're trying to get rolling and to get actual legislation and get the government involved and get things banned and that kind of shit. The church really wasn't doing that too much. But we'll get into who kind of led that. She's a force of nature that really was serious about this. And unfortunately, also a very, very sad tale of why she did it. Yeah. And we'll see. It's brutal. Yeah. Like, this whole story is really based on sadness. It's really based on tragedy. Yeah. All this other shit is ancillary, built on top of tragedies, which were the suicide of young men. So we'll get more into those cases next week as we take a look at this.
It's just everybody trying to make sense of what's happening in the world around them and needing to feel secure and then taken advantage of by crazy.
Yep. So be careful what you believe.
Yep.